So there really is no way to talk about Ruth chapter 4 without talking about the rest of the story as well. This is the summary chapter of what we've been spending the last 3 weeks on, of a story that begins with death and starvation, hopelessness, despair. And it ends with joyous celebration and a grandchild. Now, as you read the story in story form, as I've encouraged you to do over this past month, not just wait for me to read it to you, but as you read through the story, we find that really chapters 1 through 3 move pretty quickly. As the story is told, we get the setting, the foundation, the sorrow, back to survival. And then last week in chapter 3, we get the love story, the romance, the entanglement. And then at the commercial break, all of a sudden, it's like we changed authors. Now we're stuck in legal boredom. All this kinsman redeemer and transactions at the gate, and what does all that mean, and why does it matter? Well, let me tell you a little bit about why I think it matters. Because Boaz was a man of upright character. You see, when we look at all of the rules and regulations that Boaz is following, these aren't just ideas that he's come up with. This is the way God has laid it out through Scripture and tradition to say this is the right way to do things. Now, every commentary that I've read on this that's been written in the last probably 30, 40 years has all made the caveat, so I'm going to share it today as well. Yes, Ruth sounds like she's being traded like property. It's just the way it was. We know it's not the way it is today in America. It's not the way we would want it to be. Now that we've said it, we can move on. But there was a responsibility of the nearer kinsman. And that responsibility was to protect the gift of God. How many of you read all of that legal language or heard all that legal language and thought, oh yes, it's a stewardship message? I know Paul did, because his whole world is stewardship right now. But the nearer kinsman rule, if we understand how Israel was given the property from God in the promised land, and each family was given their property, and they were told, this is yours. It is a gift from God. Tend it, and it will be a blessing for you. And then sometimes bad things happen, and they had to give it up. A kinsman redeemer is not just about producing an heir. The kinsman redeemer's role actually served in a lot of ways. One, if you sold a piece of property because you had to, you didn't sell property just to trade houses back then. If you sold your property, you were in rough shape. If you had to sell the piece of property, then your kinsman redeemer had the responsibility, not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to buy it, to keep it in the family. Also, remember, property purchases back then weren't forever. They were until the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, everything reverted back to its original owner. Now, it stopped about 600 BCE, but the rules were you could sell your property, and then at the year of Jubilee, it would be returned to you. Beyond your property, you could sell yourself. You could sell yourself into servitude to others, and again, at the year of Jubilee, that servitude was done. Actually, for the people of Israel, they changed that up in Deuteronomy to be every 7 years. But the nearer kinsman was the buyback agent. They could buy back your property, keep it in the family. They could buy back your freedom so that you could then go back to tending your needs. But they also could produce a male heir. Everything went through the men. Without a male heir, you were at risk of losing your property, of losing your freedom. That's where Ruth and Naomi were at in their existence. Why does she have to sell the piece of property of Elimelech's? Because harvest season is over, gleaning is over. Yes, they've got the storehouse for what they've been able to gather so far, but then what? They have to sell off the asset to survive. Now, in storytelling world, of course, you have your main characters, and then you have the other. The nearer kinsman, I love this, never even gets named. He's not willing to step up and do the right thing. If it's just about the property, oh yeah, I'll buy the land, that's fine. They can get it back later. I'm all about having the land and having more to plant and more to harvest and more for myself. But then Boaz says, well, with the land comes the girl. And with the girl comes the responsibility. Oh, and the other mother-in-law. To which our no-named character says, yeah, then you can have the land. He doesn't want it. He's not interested. Now, as we've said throughout the book of Ruth, there are a lot of ways that you can interpret the book of Ruth. One that I like best is Scott Jose talks about Boaz as the chess master and how Boaz has set all of this up. He knows when the nearer kinsman's coming through the gate. He's got his 10 elders ready. He's sitting there, got his plan all laid out. And, okay, here's the property. You're going to want the property, but here's the girl. You're not going to want the girl. This is how I can make it all work. And he's got his strategic, his battle plan, if you will. I don't know that that's the way it worked out. But I do know that in the end, God's plan was not only revealed, but was confirmed. And that, to me, is what makes this story so important for us today. In the entirety of the book of Ruth, we only hear God attributed by the author of doing two things: restoring food in the land of Bethlehem and enabling Ruth to conceive. Everything else is conjecture by the story participants. But this is a story ultimately about two widows and a farmer being faithful to God and God being faithful to them. As we think about what this means for us today, we don't have the nearer kinsman rules. We don't have the Redeemer obligations. We certainly don't have the Levirate marriage issues in place. But what we do have is a responsibility to each other for hesed. Love in action. Nowhere in this story do we get it's all roses and rainbows. It starts with famine, which leads to death, which leads to anger with God. Naomi says, "Call me Mara, I am bitter. God has dealt harshly with me." This is not a woman whose faith has kept her comfy and happy, but it's a woman whose faith has ultimately brought her joy. As we think about the journeys of our own lives, I would dare say a lot of us have had those rough patches. One author I was reading talked about this not as a highway in Kansas where it's a straight shot to glory, but a back road in Tennessee where you have U-turns and gravel roads and bridges washed out, and it's full of switchbacks and dangerous areas. That's the reality of the life we lead, folks. This is not prosperity gospel. This is reality gospel. The good news that God is active in your life and in the lives of others through you. That God is blessing you even in the midst of the struggles. That God has a plan for you that will bring you ultimately to joy. When we think about where Boaz ended up, where Ruth ended up, where Naomi ended up, how does the story end? What are the town folks doing? They're blessing them. Boaz, may your faithfulness produce blessings. Ruth, may your loyalty produce blessings. Naomi, may your grandson be a blessing. How many grandparents do we have in the room? Okay? Are your grandchildren, and I'm asking this because my father has passed. I can't verify it with him, although I think he said it once. Are grandchildren truly God's reward for not killing your own children during their teenage years? We look at our grandchildren, and even today, grandchildren are such an expression of joy, of hope. Beyond the livelihood requirements that Naomi experienced, even today we look in the face of an infant and we see God's future. God's plan is for each of us to experience God's love. God's plan is for each of us to share God's love. If you want to be fancy and call it Hesed, love in action, that's great. If you want to call it flipping burgers on a Wednesday night, that's fine too. But as we leave this place today, I invite you to seriously consider where in your week are you practicing Hesed and you don't even know it. As the love of God flows to you, may the love of God flow through you.